Welcome back to the Whispering Hour, where the world sleeps, and stories wake. Tonight's episode moves across American winter nights, where porch lights glow, and something ordinary never leaves. Now, let's begin. My name is Michael. I was 26 years old that winter, living alone in a quiet Midwestern subdivision where nothing ever felt urgent, and very little ever felt surprising. It was the kind of place where people waved without stopping, where porch lights stayed on out of habit, and where the loudest sound most nights was a snowplow passing through long after everyone had gone to bed. I had lived there for 2 years without ever feeling watched, noticed, or particularly remembered. That changed after the storm. It came through late on a Tuesday night, steady and unremarkable at first, the kind of snowfall local news barely dramatizes anymore. I went to bed listening to the faint hush of flakes against the windows, expecting the usual white cleanup routine in the morning. When I woke, the world outside looked newly organized, as if everything had agreed to pause and reset at the same time. I noticed the snowman as soon as I pulled the curtains back. It stood across the street, directly opposite my driveway, positioned with a neatness that didn't fit the rest of the morning. 3 carefully packed sections stacked cleanly, arms formed from straight branches rather than the crooked ones kids usually grab, coal eyes placed evenly at a height that aligned almost perfectly with my own, when I stood still and looked back at it. There was no scarf, no hat, nothing playful to soften the shape. The house behind it belonged to the Harris family. A couple in their 40s and a teenage son who was rarely home. No small children, no reason for a snowman that deliberate to exist there. At first, I assumed someone nearby had built it during the storm, maybe before the snow got heavy. That explanation held until I stepped outside and noticed something that unsettled me more than the snowman itself. There were no footprints leading away from it. The snow around its base was smooth, untouched, as if the figure had always been there, and the storm had simply formed around it. As the morning progressed, neighbors began emerging to shovel their driveways. The snowman quickly became a shared curiosity. Conversations stalled mid-sentence. Someone laughed awkwardly and asked whose idea it was. No one answered. The Harris house remained quiet, curtains drawn, garage closed. No one claimed responsibility, and no one seemed particularly eager to. I crossed the street under the excuse of checking my mailbox and stood closer than I should have. The snowman's surface was firm and carefully smoothed by hand, not shaped by wind. The coal eyes weren't pressed in randomly, they were placed with care, level and measured. That detail stayed with me longer than anything else. By afternoon, the Harris father stepped outside briefly, glanced at the snowman, then at the street, then back toward his house. He didn't look confused. He looked tired, the way people do when they decide not to ask questions that won't give useful answers. He went back inside without touching it. As evening settled in, porch lights came on across the neighborhood. Warm yellow light pooled softly along the sidewalks and driveways, but the snowman remained unlit, its shape absorbing light rather than reflecting it. From my living room window, it looked closer than it had in the morning, though I knew that couldn't be true. That night, I woke without knowing why and found myself standing at the window again. The street was empty, the snow had stopped, the snowman stood exactly where it had been all day. But something felt wrong enough that I stayed there longer than I meant to, studying the snow around its base. That's when I noticed the marks. They weren't footprints, they weren't drag lines, just faint disturbances in the snow, looping loosely around the snowman in a rough circle, as if something had paced there slowly, deliberately, without ever touching it. The next morning, the Harris house kept its curtains closed. The snowman was still standing, and no one suggested taking it down. By the third morning, the snowman had stopped feeling new and started feeling deliberate. The storm had fully passed, leaving behind a clean blue sky, and a thin crust of ice that caught the sunlight sharply. Driveways were cleared, cars moved again, normal sounds returned in fragments, the distant whine of a snowblower, a delivery truck idling too long, a dog barking somewhere down the block. The snowman stayed exactly where it was, unchanged, its edges still clean despite the warming afternoon. What unsettled me most was how quickly the neighborhood adapted to it. People walked around the snowman without stopping, stepping a little wider than necessary, their attention fixed carefully elsewhere. Conversations that passed near it lowered instinctively, voices flattening as though the thing absorbed sound as easily as it absorbed light. No one pointed, no one joked about it anymore. The curiosity from the first day had evaporated, replaced by something quieter and harder to define. I noticed the Harris family again that afternoon. The teenage son came out first, headphones on, hood pulled up despite the clear sky. He didn't look at the snowman as he passed it, but his shoulders tightened, when he reached the sidewalk directly in front of it. He crossed the street without checking traffic, the movement sharp and sudden, as if rehearsed. His parents didn't follow him out. The snowman hadn't melted at all. Other snowmen in the neighborhood had begun to sag, their features slipping, coal eyes dropping unevenly. This one stayed firm, its shape intact, the surface still smoothed by hand rather than softened by sun. I found myself checking it from the window more often than I admitted, comparing it to the snowbanks around it, noticing how it seemed insulated from change. That evening, a city truck drove slowly down the street, salt crunching under its tires. It passed the snowman without slowing, without stopping, without the driver even turning his head. I watched the taillights disappear and felt something settle in my chest, a quiet confirmation that whatever this was, it had already been categorized as not requiring attention. I finally knocked on the Harris family's door the next day. The father answered after a long pause, his expression guarded but not surprised. I gestured toward the yard, keeping my tone casual, asking if they planned to take the snowman down before it turned to ice. He looked past me, toward the street, then back inside the house, as if checking something I couldn't see. "It's fine where it is," he said after a moment. That was all, no explanation, no irritation, just a statement delivered with the confidence of someone repeating something he'd already been told. He closed the door gently, not rudely, leaving me standing on the porch with the sense that I'd overstepped a boundary I hadn't known existed. That night, the temperature dropped again. A new layer of snow fell quietly, just enough to cover the street and soften the edges of everything else. When I checked the window before bed, the snowman looked closer than before. I told myself it was the snow, the way depth perception shifts in low light. I told myself a lot of things. I didn't sleep well. Sometime after midnight, I heard movement outside, not footsteps, not voices, just the subtle sound of snow settling where it shouldn't have been disturbed. I didn't go to the window immediately. I lay there, listening, waiting for the sound to repeat. It didn't. In the morning, the street was quiet again. Fresh snow covered the sidewalks, smooth and unbroken except for the usual tracks near driveways. The snowman stood in the Harris yard as always, but the disturbances around its base were clearer now. The same shallow looping marks I'd seen before had returned, tracing a wider circle this time, extending closer to the sidewalk. Still no footprints. I noticed something else too. The coal eyes, which had been level before, now angled very slightly upward, their focus shifted just enough that when I stood in my driveway, it felt less like I was looking at the snowman, and more like it was aware of where I stood. No one mentioned it. Mail was delivered, trash bins were set out and collected. A neighbor waved to me from across the street without slowing down. Life continued around the snowman with careful precision, everyone behaving as though the safest thing to do was treat it as scenery. That was when I realized the snowman didn't need to move to change things, it only needed the neighborhood to decide it belonged there. By the end of the week, the snowman had outlasted every reasonable explanation. Daytime temperatures climbed just enough to soften the edges of snowbanks and turn sidewalks slick, yet the figure across the street remained unchanged. Its surface stayed smooth and compact, the coal eyes dark and dry, the branch arms rigid in the same measured spread. It did not sag, it did not shed, it did not react to the sun the way everything else did. What changed instead was the street. People adjusted their routines without discussion, dog walkers crossed early, joggers altered routes. Children who had been out the first afternoon after the storm no longer appeared at all. The Harris house stayed closed up, lights on inside but curtains drawn tight, as if the family had decided that visibility worked better in one direction only. No one complained, no one asked the city to remove it. The snowman existed inside a pocket of quiet permission. I noticed a police cruiser roll through one evening just after dusk. It slowed slightly as it passed the Harris yard, brake lights glowing for a moment, then continued on. The officer never got out, the car did not circle back. The message was subtle but clear enough to register: this did not require intervention. That night, the temperature dropped hard, wind picked up, scraping dry snow across the asphalt in thin, whispering lines. I stood at my window longer than I meant to, watching the snowman absorb the streetlight's glow. The coal eyes looked darker against the pale yard, the mouth's curve unchanged. When a gust of wind cut through the street, branches swaying, trash cans rattling, the snowman did not respond. It held its shape with a steadiness that felt practiced. Sometime after midnight, I heard the sound again. Not footsteps, not voices, but the soft compression of snow under pressure. I did not rush to the window, I waited until the sound passed, until the street settled back into stillness. When I finally looked, the yard appeared undisturbed at first glance. The snowman stood as it always had. The marks were there in the morning. They circled wider this time, looping out toward the sidewalk and back again, the snow disturbed just enough to show movement without direction. The pattern suggested patience rather than effort, the kind of pacing done by someone with time to spare. There were still no footprints, nothing that could be followed away from the yard. I crossed the street again, stopping well short of the base. Up close, the snowman felt larger than before, not taller or wider, but present in a way that pushed against attention. The coal eyes sat at a height that matched mine when I stood still. I shifted my weight, and the sensation followed, not tracking me exactly, but aligning with where I settled. I stepped back. Later that day, a thaw began in earnest, snow peeled off roofs in heavy sheets, gutters ran steadily. The neighborhood loosened around the edges, winter's grip easing just enough to promise change. The snowman remained intact, its surface firm and dry, insulated from the warmth that softened everything else. By evening, it stood alone in a yard gone patchy and wet, an island of winter where winter should have been retreating. That was when the Harris front door opened. The father stepped out, paused, and looked directly at the snowman. He did not glance at the street, he did not look around, he walked forward and stopped an arm's length away. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then he reached out and adjusted one of the coal pieces, pressing it gently back into place, correcting a tilt so small I hadn't noticed it. When he went back inside, the door closed softly behind him. The next morning, the street looked wrong. Lawns were bare in places, driveways ran wet and dark, the snowman stood unchanged, its base now touching exposed grass. The contrast drew the eye immediately, but no one commented on it. People passed with careful distance, eyes forward, movements efficient. The figure had crossed an invisible line from curiosity to fixture. I realized then that the neighborhood had made its decision. Not loudly, not together, but completely. The snowman wasn't something to be explained or removed, it was something to be accommodated. Weeks later, long after the last snowbank vanished, it was still there. By then, people stopped noticing it at all. That was the part that stayed with me. Not that it remained, but that it did so without resistance. The street learned how to look past it. The houses learned how to face it, and once that happened, there was no reason for it to leave. Some things don't need to move to take their place, they just need everyone else to agree they belong. The elementary school had been closed for 3 days, by the time the snowman appeared. A combination of heavy snowfall and sub-zero temperatures had turned the parking lot into a flat white field, the playground buried beneath drifts tall enough to swallow the swings entirely. The district sent out automated messages reminding parents that classes would resume once conditions improved, but no one expected activity there before then. That was why it stood out immediately. I drove past the school on my way home just after sunset, the road narrowed by snowbanks on either side, headlights catching reflective signs and nothing else. The snowman stood near the main entrance, positioned directly beneath the school sign, its shape clear and deliberate against the blank brick wall behind it. Three stacked sections, tightly packed. Branch arms angled slightly downward. Coal eyes placed evenly, set at a height that matched an adult's gaze rather than a child's. The gate to the playground was locked, the front doors were secured. No tire tracks crossed the lot, no footprints led toward or away from the snowman. The snow around it was smooth, untouched, as if it had been placed there before the storm finished sealing the area off. I slowed without meaning to. The building's lights were off except for a single emergency glow near the side entrance. That light reflected faintly off the snowman's surface, giving it just enough definition to feel intentional. It wasn't festive, it wasn't playful, it looked like it belonged there in the same way signage and railings belong to public property, installed rather than created. By the next morning, photos had started circulating in local group chats. Someone joked about kids sneaking out at night. Someone else mentioned a prank. The school district responded with a short message stating they were aware of the situation and that no action was required at this time. The phrasing was careful, neutral, the kind of language meant to settle rather than explain. I walked past the school later that afternoon, drawn by a need to see it up close. The temperature hadn't risen enough to soften anything. Snow squeaked faintly under my boots, the sound sharp in the quiet. From a distance, the snowman looked unchanged. Up close, the details felt more precise than they should have. The coal eyes were clean and dry. The mouth was curved gently, not smiling, not frowning. No scarf, no buttons, nothing decorative. The branch arms were stripped smooth, bark rubbed away, their ends cut clean rather than snapped. The base was packed so firmly it felt more like ice than snow. A security camera above the entrance pointed directly toward it. I followed its angle back to the building, then returned my attention to the snowman. If the camera had captured anything, no one was sharing it. The district's message hadn't been updated. The snowman remained exactly where it was, centered beneath the school's name, aligned with the doors children usually poured out of every afternoon. By evening, cars slowed as they passed. Some stopped briefly at the curb, headlights lingering. No one got out, no one approached it. The school sat dark behind it, windows reflecting nothing but snow and sky. The silence felt deliberate, maintained. The next day, temperatures climbed just enough to affect the snowbanks along the road. Slush formed at the edges. Icicles began to drip from the building's gutters. The snowman didn't change, its shape stayed clean, its surface firm, the coal eyes still set and watching forward. That was when the sign appeared. It was taped neatly to the gate, laminated, the corners trimmed evenly. School closed, do not enter grounds. The message was redundant. The school had been closed for days. The snowman stood just inside the boundary, on the school side of the fence, exactly where it would be noticed and exactly where no one was allowed to touch it. That night, as I passed again, I realized something else. The snow around the snowman's base showed faint disturbances, shallow marks circling it loosely, careful not to cross the boundary of the fence. No footprints led outward, no drag lines crossed the lot, just signs of movement that never approached too close. The school stayed closed, the snowman stayed standing. And whatever had placed it there seemed content to wait, knowing no one else would step past the gate to make it leave. By the fourth day, the school district's silence had begun to feel intentional. The automated closure messages continued to arrive each morning, identical in tone and wording, as though no one had bothered to update the situation beyond acknowledging that winter still existed. The snowman was never mentioned directly. In conversations, online posts, and passing remarks, it became that thing out front, or whatever they put by the sign, language vague enough to avoid responsibility. I walked by again that afternoon, taking the longer route home without admitting why. The snowman looked exactly the same. No sagging, no melt. The coal eyes remained dry despite the thawing snow around it, the surface packed so tightly it reflected light instead of absorbing it. The school sign above it listed the building's name in faded blue letters, and the snowman's head sat directly beneath them, centered with a precision that felt measured rather than accidental. A police cruiser idled briefly at the curb while I was there. The officer stayed inside, engine running, heater blasting faintly through the closed windows. He stared forward, hands on the wheel, not at the snowman, not at the building, but straight ahead as if waiting for a light to change. After a minute, he pulled away without stepping out. No report, no tape, no interaction. The absence of action carried more weight than intervention would have. That evening, someone taped a paper snowflake to the fence near the gate. It was small, folded carefully, the kind children make in classrooms during December. By morning, it was gone. No trace of it remained, not even torn paper or tape residue. The snowman stood untouched, the space around it clean and deliberate. Temperatures dropped again overnight. A fresh layer of snow fell just thick enough to reset the scene, smoothing the parking lot and sidewalks into uniform white. The snowman's base was ringed once more by faint disturbances, the same looping marks as before, tracing a careful arc that stopped short of the fence. It looked less like pacing now and more like maintenance. The security camera above the door still pointed directly at it. I contacted the district office that afternoon, more out of obligation than expectation. The woman who answered listened quietly, then thanked me for my concern. She assured me the situation was being monitored and reminded me that the school grounds were closed for safety reasons. When I asked who had built the snowman, she paused. "It's not something we're addressing at this time," she said, carefully. The phrasing felt practiced. I hung up with the sense that I had stepped into a conversation already in progress, one that didn't need my input. By dusk, people had started altering their routines. Parents walked their kids on the opposite side of the street. Dog walkers crossed early and didn't look back. Cars slowed as they passed, headlights lingering on the snowman for just a second too long before moving on. No one stopped, no one approached the gate. What unsettled me most was how ordinary it became. The snowman blended into the rhythm of the neighborhood as easily as a stop sign, or a bus shelter. Something that had always been there, something to be navigated around rather than questioned. The school's windows reflected the streetlights at night, and the snowman absorbed the glow without casting a shadow of its own. Late that night, I stood across the street and watched the building. The emergency light near the side entrance flickered faintly, cycling the way they do when power is being tested. For a moment, I thought I saw movement reflected in the glass, but the lot remained empty. The snowman stood exactly where it had been placed, its coal eyes aligned with the doors children usually ran through on warmer days. I realized then that the fence wasn't there to protect the school. It was there to protect the snowman from being interfered with. The next morning, the closure message changed slightly. One additional sentence appeared at the end of the automated text: "Please do not gather near school property until further notice." No reason was given. The snowman remained. And the longer it stood there, the clearer it became that it wasn't waiting to be removed. It was waiting for everyone to accept that this space no longer belonged to them. By the following week, the school's closure stopped feeling temporary. The automated messages continued, but their timing grew inconsistent, arriving later in the morning or not at all. Parents stopped speculating about reopening dates. Children adapted quickly, slipping into indoor routines, their presence removed from the sidewalks entirely. The street in front of the school grew quieter than any residential block had a right to be. The snowman remained. A thaw came through midweek, aggressive enough to carve channels through the snowbanks, and expose patches of asphalt in the lot. Gutters ran steadily, icicles shattered and fell. Everything softened, everything except the figure beneath the sign. Its surface stayed compact and dry, edges clean, coal eyes intact. By Thursday evening, it stood alone on a shrinking island of snow, a shape out of season that refused to follow the weather's instructions. I stopped across the street and watched a city maintenance truck approach. It slowed near the curb, hazard lights blinking, then continued on without stopping. The driver didn't look toward the fence. The decision seemed made before the truck arrived. The moment passed without friction, which felt like the point. That night, the disturbances around the snowman's base appeared again. They were clearer now against the thinning snow, shallow arcs that traced a careful perimeter. Not random, not hesitant. The mark suggested repetition, the kind that comes from returning to the same place over and over, maintaining a boundary that mattered. The next morning, a new sign had been added to the gate. Laminated, centered, official in tone and formatting. Property closed, do not approach or interfere. It replaced the older notice without explanation. The school's name remained above the Snowman, unchanged, the letters casting faint shadows that never touched it. I noticed something else then. The security camera had been adjusted slightly, its angle lowered by just a degree or two. It no longer pointed at the entrance doors, it pointed directly at the Snowman. That afternoon, the Harris father from my street stood beside me at the curb, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed ahead. We didn't greet each other, we watched together as cars passed, slowed, and moved on. After a while, he spoke without looking at me. "They won't open it again," he said. I asked him what he meant. "The school," he replied. "Not like it was." He didn't elaborate, he didn't need to. The statement felt less like speculation and more like recognition. We stood there until the cold began to bite again, then separated without saying goodbye. By the end of the month, the district announced the school would remain closed indefinitely due to ongoing safety assessments. Students were reassigned, buses rerouted, notices posted. The building was no longer part of the daily map people carried in their heads. It became background, something passed without thought. The Snowman stayed standing. Spring arrived unevenly, grass pushed through in wet patches, trees budded. The last snow retreated from everywhere, except that small section of ground near the sign. The Snowman's base now touched bare earth, the contrast stark enough to draw the eye, but no one commented. People had learned where not to look. One morning, the coal eyes were gone. Not fallen, not misplaced, removed cleanly, leaving smooth hollows behind. The mouth remained, the arms remained, the shape held. The empty eye sockets faced forward, aligned with the doors that would never open again. That was the last change anyone noticed. After that, the figure blended into the landscape the way unused buildings do, present, unchallenged, quietly absorbed. We stopped talking about it entirely. The fence stayed locked, the camera stayed trained, the signs stayed posted. I pass the school sometimes when winter comes back around, when snow begins to gather and the street grows quiet again. The Snowman is always there, rebuilt when necessary, maintained without witnesses. It stands beneath the sign, steady and patient, marking a place that no longer belongs to the people who once filled it. Some spaces don't need to be taken by force, they only need something simple placed there, and enough silence for everyone else to agree to leave it alone. The Snowman had been there longer than anyone could remember, which was strange only because everyone remembered it being there. That contradiction settled into the neighborhood quietly, without announcement, the way certain facts do when questioning them feels more uncomfortable than accepting them. I first noticed it at the end of January, standing in the narrow green space between two cul-de-sacs. Not a yard, not a park, just a shared strip of land the city never bothered to label. The Snowman stood slightly off-center, positioned where people naturally cut through on their walks. 3 sections, compact and well-balanced, no scarf or hat, coal eyes set evenly, branch arms angled downward as if resting. What caught my attention wasn't the Snowman itself, it was the way people moved around it. They didn't avoid it, they didn't slow down. They adjusted naturally, like stepping around a bench or a signpost that had always been part of the path. No hesitation, no curiosity. The movement looked practiced, unconscious, that was what made me stop. I asked my neighbor later that evening when it had gone up. She thought for a moment, genuinely considering the question. "It's been there," she said finally, sounding faintly amused. "Since the big snow, I think." The big snow had been before Christmas. That didn't feel right. I remembered that storm clearly. Streets buried, cars stranded, no Snowman then, not there, not anywhere near that space. I would have noticed it. I walked that cut-through almost every day. The next morning, I checked my phone. Photos from December showed the area clearly. Snowbanks, trees, footprints. No snowman. January photos, taken only a few weeks later, showed it clearly in the background. No comments, no mention, just there, framed casually as if it belonged. I asked someone else. He frowned slightly, trying to picture it. It's always there, he said, then paused. I mean, yeah, always. The pause mattered more than the answer. Over the next few days, I started asking carefully phrased questions. Not who built it, but when did you first notice it? Every answer differed slightly, but they all shared the same problem. No one could anchor it to a specific day, no one remembered a moment of surprise, no one recalled reacting to it at all. It had simply existed. The snowman didn't melt as February edged closer to March. Snow receded everywhere else, grass appearing in thin brown patches, but the ground beneath the snowman stayed white and compact. Fresh snow seemed to collect there even on clear days, a shallow ring that refreshed itself without explanation. I stood near it one afternoon, studying the coal eyes. They were worn smooth, edges rounded as if handled repeatedly. I couldn't imagine when that handling would have happened. No footprints marked the snow around it, no signs of repair. Yet the wear suggested time, use, familiarity. That night, I dreamed I was walking past it and couldn't remember my own house number. The street looked correct, the buildings familiar, but the order felt wrong, as though something had been inserted, and everything else had shifted to accommodate it. I woke unsettled, the sensation clinging longer than usual. The next day, I noticed a new detail, the snowman was slightly closer to the path. Not moved, exactly. More like the path had adjusted around it. Foot traffic curved more tightly now, compressing the snow nearer its base. People stepped closer without noticing they were doing it. When I pointed it out to someone, they looked at me with mild confusion. It's always been right there, they said. I checked my photos again. The framing had changed. In older images, the snowman sat farther back, in newer ones, it occupied more of the frame, as if the camera itself had learned where to focus. Dates didn't line up, shadows contradicted timestamps. The sequence no longer told a clean story. I realized then that the problem wasn't when the snowman appeared, the problem was that the neighborhood had reorganized its memory to make room for it. Not through fear, not through denial, through something quieter and more dangerous. Acceptance without recollection. And once something is remembered as having always been there, there is no longer any reason to imagine a time without it. The first thing I stopped trusting was my sense of sequence. Not facts exactly, but order. The way events are supposed to line up cleanly when you look back at them. I would remember walking past the snowman in the morning, and be unable to recall whether I had done so the day before, even though the habit itself felt old. The path between the cul-de-sacs began to feel like a loop rather than a shortcut, a place where time flattened instead of moving forward. I started keeping notes. Nothing dramatic at first. Dates, times, small observations, snowman intact, ground firm, no melt. I took photos from the same spot each day, lining the frame up with a bent tree and a storm drain to keep things consistent. The images looked normal when viewed individually. It was only when I scrolled through them that something felt wrong. The snowman's position relative to the background shifted subtly from day to day, not enough to register as movement, but enough to disrupt alignment. The tree drifted left, the drain edged closer, the snowman remained centered. When I showed the photos to a friend, he frowned politely and handed the phone back. They looked the same, he said, the comment final enough to close the subject. I checked the metadata, dates overlapped. Some files listed times that didn't exist, minutes repeating or skipping without explanation. I told myself it was a phone glitch, a software error brought on by cold weather. That explanation worked until I realized the same inconsistencies appeared in photos taken indoors, nowhere near the snowman. Conversations began slipping in similar ways. I'd mention the snowman casually, not as a concern, just as a reference point. People nodded along, adding details that contradicted one another without noticing. Someone said it had been repaired after a storm, someone else insisted it had never changed. When I asked follow-up questions, their certainty faded quickly, answers loosening at the edges until they became guesses. What unsettled me most was how quickly people lost interest, once they'd answered. The subject dissolved as soon as it was acknowledged, leaving behind a faint sense of irritation, as though I had lingered on something trivial for too long. One afternoon, I decided to test my memory directly. I walked past the snowman without looking at it, counting my steps, focusing on the rhythm of movement rather than the object itself. When I reached the far end of the path, I turned around and tried to picture it in detail. The shape came easily. The coal eyes. The branch arms. But when I tried to remember exactly where it stood in relation to the path, the image blurred. I couldn't anchor it. The memory slid, refusing to settle. I went back and stood in front of it, close enough to feel the cold radiating off its surface. The snowman felt solid, dense, its presence undeniable. I stepped back again and turned away. Within seconds, the certainty thinned. That night, I dreamed I was scrolling through old family photos and finding the snowman in all of them, standing in the background of holidays and birthdays, always slightly out of focus. In the dream, no one commented on it. No one questioned why it was there. I woke with the uncomfortable sense that something had been added retroactively to my life, stitched in so carefully that only the seams gave it away. The next morning, the notes I'd written looked unfamiliar. The handwriting was mine, but the phrasing felt off, observations stated with a confidence I didn't remember having. One line in particular stood out: "It's easier not to think about when it started." I didn't remember writing that. I walked the path again and noticed new footprints near the snowman's base, not fresh enough to track, not old enough to ignore. They circled loosely, overlapping, suggesting repeated passes rather than a single visit. I tried to count them and lost track almost immediately, my attention sliding away from the task without effort. When I looked up, a woman was walking past, stepping around the snowman smoothly, naturally. I asked her if she remembered when it had appeared. She smiled faintly. "It's always been there," she said, then hesitated. "Hasn't it?" The hesitation lingered after she'd gone. I realized then that the snowman didn't need to be remembered correctly, it only needed to be remembered consistently. Details could blur, dates could shift, as long as everyone agreed it belonged in the past, the present would make room for it automatically. I stood there longer than I should have, trying to fix the moment in my mind, to create a memory solid enough to resist revision. The effort was exhausting, like holding a thought still while everything around it rearranged itself. When I finally walked away, the path felt shorter than before. And for the first time, I couldn't be entirely sure whether I had already walked it that day. I stopped trying to document it after the notes began correcting themselves. Not rewriting exactly, just smoothing over rough edges I remembered leaving in place. Sentences shortened. Questions turned into statements, dates resolved into ranges. When I compared newer entries to older ones, the handwriting stayed consistent, but the tone shifted toward certainty, as if the page had grown tired of doubt. I tested it once more, deliberately this time. I wrote a single line at the top of a fresh page: "The snowman appeared this winter." I underlined it twice and closed the notebook. When I opened it later that evening, the line remained, but the wording had changed. "The snowman has always been here," the underlines were gone. I felt a brief spike of panic, sharp and clarifying, followed by something calmer that arrived too quickly to feel earned. The calm suggested a practical conclusion, that I must have misremembered what I wrote. The suggestion fit so neatly that resisting it felt unreasonable. I closed the notebook again and did not open it. As February ended, the path between the cul-de-sacs grew muddy at the edges, winter loosening its grip everywhere except that narrow strip of ground. The snowman remained intact, its base ringed by compacted white that never thinned. People continued to pass it without hesitation, their steps falling into the same curved pattern. Watching them felt like observing a habit rather than a choice. I tried one last experiment. I stood beside the snowman and waited for someone I knew to pass. When they did, I asked a simple question, keeping my voice casual. "Do you remember when they put this in?" They looked at me, then at the snowman, then back at me with mild concern. "Put it in," they said, as if I'd asked why a tree had been planted. "It's just there." The answer wasn't defensive. It wasn't dismissive, it was complete. That night, I scrolled through my phone again, farther back this time. Old messages, archived threads, photos I hadn't opened in years. The snowman appeared sporadically, never centered, always peripheral. In one picture, it stood behind a group of people gathered for a winter event, partially blocked by a parked car. The date stamped the image 2 years earlier than the storm I remembered. I checked the weather history. No snow that week. The discrepancy didn't register the way it should have. The information slid past, unexamined. I began noticing how often people referenced the space around the snowman without naming it. Directions included phrases like "by the cut-through" or "near the usual spot." No one said the snowman. The object had become a coordinate, a fixed point that oriented movement without requiring acknowledgement. On a warm afternoon in early March, I arrived at the path to find the snowman gone. The ground where it had stood was bare, wet grass pressed flat into a rough circle. No piles of melted snow, no debris. The space looked used, familiar, as though something heavy had occupied it for a long time, and then been removed carefully. People walked the path as they always had, curving instinctively around the empty space. I waited for surprise, for comment, for reaction. None came. I asked a passerby what had been there. They glanced at the ground briefly, then shook their head. "Nothing," they said, already stepping around the spot. Their foot landed wide of center, the habit intact despite the absence. That evening, I realized I couldn't picture the snowman clearly anymore. The details that had once felt precise blurred at the edges. Coal eyes became generic, branch arms lost their angle, the memory flattened into an idea rather than an image. When I tried to hold on to it, the effort felt unnecessary, even indulgent. A week later, a light snow fell overnight. In the morning, the path was dusted white again, footprints already cutting the familiar curve. At the center of it, a new shape stood, smaller than before, less defined, but unmistakable in its placement. I didn't stop. I walked around it like everyone else, my steps adjusting without conscious thought. The motion felt correct, efficient. As I reached the far end of the path, I tried to remember when it had returned, and the question dissolved before it could fully form. Some things don't need to be remembered to persist, they only need the space to be arranged so that forgetting feels natural. By the time I reached my door, I couldn't be sure whether there had ever been a time when the path had been empty at all. The mailbox disappeared sometime after the second snowfall, though no one could agree on the exact day. It wasn't vandalized, wasn't knocked over by a plow, and hadn't been flagged for replacement. One morning, it was simply gone. In its place stood a snowman, positioned neatly at the edge of the road where the post truck usually slowed before stopping. I noticed it while pulling out of my driveway, the absence registering before the replacement did. The mailbox had been there for years, dented slightly on one side, its red flag sun-faded and stiff from winters of neglect. Seeing that stretch of curb without it felt wrong in a way that didn't immediately name itself. The snowman stood where the post would have stopped, 3 compact sections stacked cleanly, coal eyes facing the street, branch arms angled slightly outward as if marking the spot. At first, I assumed it was temporary, someone making a joke, someone waiting on a replacement. That explanation held until the mail truck arrived. The driver slowed, glanced at the snowman, and stopped anyway. He leaned out, scanned the curb, then reached down and set the mail carefully at the base of the snowman, tucking the envelopes into the packed snow as if that had always been the arrangement. He didn't look confused, he didn't hesitate, he drove off without adjusting his route. I stood there longer than I should have, watching the snowman hold a stack of letters against its base, the paper bright against the white. The act felt rehearsed, not improvised. Like a routine that had been updated quietly and accepted without discussion. Later that afternoon, I asked my neighbor if she knew what had happened to the mailbox. She frowned slightly, thinking. "That's where it's always been," she said, nodding toward the snowman. Then she paused, her expression tightening just a little. "I mean, you know what I mean." I did, unfortunately. The next day, more mail arrived. Packages were leaned carefully against the snowman's lower section, balanced with surprising precision. Someone had cleared a shallow path through the snow leading directly to it, not from any house in particular, but from the sidewalk, as though the neighborhood had agreed on the most efficient approach. The mailbox never reappeared. By the end of the week, people stopped mentioning it entirely. They walked up, collected their mail from the snowman, and left without comment. The coal eyes stayed dry. The surface remained firm despite daytime thaws. Fresh snow seemed to accumulate around it selectively, reinforcing its shape even as the rest of the curb began to slush and darken. I tried to file a request with the city. The form asked for the location of the missing mailbox. When I entered the address, the system auto-filled a note beneath it, "Mail delivery point confirmed." No option to report removal, no field to describe what had replaced it. I closed the browser without submitting anything. That night, I watched from my window as a woman from 2 houses down approached the snowman. She adjusted one of the branch arms slightly, angling it so envelopes wouldn't slide free. The movement was careful, practiced. When she finished, she stepped back, satisfied, and walked away without looking at it again. The snowman didn't feel decorative, it felt infrastructural. I realized then that nothing had announced the change. No notice, no disruption. The mailbox hadn't been taken away so much as it had been superseded. The function remained, only the form had changed. And that was the part that unsettled me most. Because if something could be replaced so completely that no one remembered it going missing, then the snowman wasn't just standing in for the mailbox. It was proving how easily anything could be removed, as long as something else quietly took its place. The change settled in fully, once the neighborhood stopped checking the curb before stepping out. People walked straight toward the snowman now, their movements efficient, practiced. Hands reached automatically to the same spot near its base where envelopes were stacked, fingers brushing packed snow without hesitation. The mailbox wasn't missed so much as it was forgotten, its absence smoothed over by the ease with which the routine continued. What unsettled me was how quickly the snowman became protected. One afternoon, a delivery driver left a large box leaning against it, the cardboard pressed into the snow just enough to hold. When a gust of wind knocked it loose, a man from across the street stepped out and repositioned the package carefully, packing fresh snow around the base to keep it stable. He worked with quiet focus, the way someone might repair a loose step or a sagging fence. When he finished, he brushed his gloves clean and went back inside without looking at the snowman's face. I noticed the ground around it changing. The snow was tamped down into a firm platform, compacted by repeated use. Someone had cleared a wider approach path, straightening the curve that had once led to the mailbox. The route made more sense now, more direct, efficient. It felt like an improvement, which made the unease harder to justify. The postal truck arrived at the same time every day. The driver no longer leaned out to check anything. He slowed, stopped, and delivered the mail to the snowman with the same practiced motion each time. On particularly cold mornings, he tucked the letters deeper into the packed snow, shielding them from the wind. Once, I saw him adjust the angle of the branch arm so it cast a bit of shadow over the envelopes. That detail stayed with me. I asked him about it the next day, keeping my tone light. He looked at me blankly for a moment, then shrugged. "This is the delivery point," he said. Not defensive, not confused, just stating a fact. City crews began clearing snow more carefully around that section of curb. Plows angled away from it, leaving a small island untouched while the rest of the street was scraped clean. When a ridge of ice formed near its base, someone chipped it away by hand rather than risk damaging the structure. No one coordinated this. It happened in fragments, small acts of maintenance distributed across the block. The snowman stayed pristine. At night, when the streetlights came on, its surface reflected just enough glow to remain visible without drawing attention. The coal eyes were still, unremarkable, no more expressive than the black screws on a street sign. I realized then that it had crossed an invisible threshold. It was no longer a novelty or a curiosity, it was infrastructure. The mailbox existed now only in vague references. Someone mentioned before the snow once, trailing off mid-sentence as if the thought didn't warrant completion. Another neighbor gestured toward the curb and said, they moved it, without specifying who they were, or what exactly had been moved. I checked old photos again. The mailbox appeared in some, missing in others. The transition wasn't clean. In several images, the space was blurred, as if the camera hadn't quite decided what belonged there. In newer photos, the snowman occupied the frame confidently, its placement precise, unquestioned. One evening, I watched as a child approached it with a letter clutched in both hands. He hesitated for just a second, then slid the envelope into the packed snow and stepped back. His mother didn't correct him. She didn't even watch. The act felt learned, inherited without instruction. That was when I understood the danger. The snowman wasn't replacing the mailbox as an object, it was replacing the idea of one. The expectation, the permission to accept something different, as long as the function continued uninterrupted. If the mail arrived, if routines held, if nothing essential appeared broken, then nothing had to be questioned. The form could change completely, and it wouldn't matter. I stood at my window that night and tried to picture the curb without the snowman. The image wouldn't settle. My mind filled the space automatically, the way it does with familiar landmarks. The absence felt wrong now, disruptive. That realization frightened me more than the snowman ever had, because it meant the replacement was complete. And once something takes over so seamlessly, that its removal feels like the disruption. There is no longer a path back to what it replaced. The first sign that the replacement had gone too far came quietly, folded into routine like everything else. One morning, the mail didn't arrive. The truck passed through at its usual time, slowed at the curb, then continued on without stopping. No hesitation, no correction. The snowman stood where it always had, pristine and unchanged, but the space at its base remained empty. No letters, no packages. The interruption felt wrong in a way I hadn't expected, sharp and disorienting, as though a rule had been broken, that no one remembered agreeing to. People noticed. Not loudly, not with anger, but with confusion that bordered on irritation. A woman stood by the snowman longer than usual, scanning the packed snow as if something might still be hidden there. A man checked the curb twice, then looked down the street, his expression tightening. No one mentioned the mailbox, no one asked where the mail should go. The assumption was clear, the failure belonged to the system, not the replacement. The next day, the mail returned. It was stacked more carefully than before, tucked into the snow with deliberate precision. Someone had carved a shallow groove into the base to keep envelopes upright. The branch arms were adjusted again, angled just enough to frame the space. The solution had arrived without discussion, smoother than any official fix would have been. That evening, a city notice appeared taped to a nearby utility pole. It announced a temporary adjustment to neighborhood delivery infrastructure, due to winter conditions. No details, no diagrams, just a reassurance that service would continue as expected. The wording felt familiar, final. I realized then that the mailbox hadn't been removed accidentally, it had been decommissioned. Not physically dismantled, but rendered unnecessary by a quieter solution that avoided complaint and paperwork. The snowman had proven itself reliable. That was all the justification required. As temperatures climbed, the contrast grew more unsettling. Snow melted from lawns and sidewalks, retreating into narrow, dirty patches. The snowman's base stayed firm and white, refreshed overnight by light dustings that didn't touch anywhere else. Someone brought out a small shovel, and reinforced the platform when it began to thin, packing snow from shaded corners of the block. The effort was communal, unspoken. I thought about intervening. About knocking it down, scattering the coal, breaking the shape enough to force a reaction. The thought didn't last. The imagined disruption felt excessive, almost rude, like tampering with a traffic signal because you disliked its placement. The replacement had earned its protection. One afternoon, a city worker arrived with a clipboard. He stood at the curb, checked a list, and nodded once. He didn't approach the snowman, he didn't photograph it, he wrote something down and left. Later, I checked the city's online map of neighborhood assets. The mailbox was gone. In its place, a small marker labeled the location as a community delivery point. No image, no description, just a dot where the snowman stood. The change was complete. Weeks later, after a warm stretch finally defeated the last stubborn snowbanks, the snowman still stood, its shape maintained through careful reinforcement. It looked out of place now, absurd against the bare grass and budding trees, but no one reacted to that either. Normal adjusted around it, redefining itself without friction. I realized I could no longer remember the mailbox clearly. The dented side, the stiff red flag, the sound it made when it closed. The memory had thinned, replaced by the image of stacked letters against packed snow, a routine that felt older than it had any right to. One morning, I woke to find the snowman gone. Not collapsed, not melted, removed cleanly, the curb scraped bare. For a moment, the space felt violently empty. I waited for relief, for recognition, for someone to comment. Instead, confusion rippled briefly, then settled. By afternoon, a temporary plastic bin had been placed at the curb. Plain, functional, unremarkable. People used it without comment, slipping mail inside, lifting the lid with practiced ease. The snowman was never mentioned again, but the bin never felt permanent. And every winter after that, when snow began to gather and routine slowed, I found myself watching the curb more closely than I should have, waiting for something familiar to return. Not because it was comforting, but because once you've seen how easily something essential can be replaced, you understand how quietly it can happen again, and how little resistance it will meet the next time. The first time I stopped walking, no one else did. It was early evening, the kind of winter dusk that arrives before you've fully accepted the day is over. The sidewalk was busy in that subdued way neighborhoods get after work hours, people heading home, dogs being walked, headlights easing into driveways. The snowman stood at the corner where the sidewalk bent toward the park entrance, positioned close enough to be noticed, but far enough off the path to avoid forcing anyone to slow down, except I did slow down. The snowman wasn't elaborate. 3 compact sections, cleanly stacked. Branch arms angled downward, not reaching, not gesturing. Coal eyes set evenly, level with where my gaze naturally landed when I stopped. No scarf, no hat, nothing playful. It felt unfinished in a way that suggested restraint rather than neglect. I looked around, waiting for some acknowledgement from someone else. A glance, a pause, a reaction that would confirm this wasn't just me overthinking a winter decoration. Nothing happened. A woman walked past, phone pressed to her ear, stepping around the snowman with a fluid motion that suggested familiarity. A man jogged by without breaking stride, a child tugged on his glove and adjusted his path without looking up. No one stopped, no one stared, no one even registered surprise. I told myself that was the point. Snowmen are normal, winter invites them. There was nothing inherently wrong with one standing near a park entrance. The unease I felt was my own problem, not evidence of anything else. But as I resumed walking, the sensation followed me. Over the next few days, I found myself noticing the snowman again and again, not because it changed, but because my reaction to it didn't. Every time I approached it, my steps slowed just enough to be conscious. Every time I passed it, I resisted the urge to look back. The effort felt disproportionate, like bracing against a wind no one else could feel. I started paying attention to other people. They treated the snowman the way you treat a bench or a lamppost, an object to navigate around, not engage with. Their movements adjusted subtly, efficiently. No hesitation, no curiosity. It wasn't being ignored, it was being accounted for. I asked a coworker about it casually one afternoon, describing its location without naming it outright. He nodded immediately. "Yeah," he said. "That spot by the park." I waited. "That snowman," he added, after a pause that felt automatic. "It's been there." "How long?" I asked. He frowned, then shrugged. "Since winter," he said, as though that settled it. The answer irritated me more than it should have. Winter had been here for months. The storm cycles were distinct. I remembered the sidewalk before the snowman, the empty bend where the path opened toward the park. I remembered because I had walked it nearly every day. Or at least, I thought I had. One evening, I stood across the street and watched people pass it. I counted how many adjusted their steps, every single one did. None of them looked conscious of the adjustment. The path curved around the snowman as if it had always been shaped that way, as if the object had been present when the sidewalk was poured. I crossed closer, standing just inside the edge of the path. From there, the snowman felt more present, not larger, but heavier, its placement exact. It wasn't blocking anything, it wasn't in the way, it was simply there, occupying a space that now seemed designed for it. A couple walked past me, talking quietly. I turned slightly, catching part of their conversation, and heard one of them say, "You don't have to slow down." The comment wasn't directed at me, it was casual, reassuring, but it landed hard. I realized then that no one else was fighting their instincts. They weren't choosing to ignore the snowman, they had never felt the need to react to it at all. The isolation didn't come from being afraid of the snowman, it came from being the only one who still felt there was something to notice. The comment started small, subtle enough that I could have dismissed them if I'd wanted to. Someone asking if I was feeling alright when I paused near the park entrance. A coworker laughing lightly and telling me I was reading too much into winter stuff. The tone was always kind, always reasonable, which somehow made it worse. Concern framed as reassurance leaves very little room to argue back. I tried changing my route. For a few days, I avoided the park entrance entirely, taking a longer way home that looped past houses instead of open space. The adjustment felt forced, inefficient, like swimming against a current I hadn't noticed before. When I finally returned to the usual path, the relief I felt unsettled me more than the snowman ever had. It was still there, unchanged, unbothered, positioned exactly where it belonged. That thought startled me enough that I stopped walking again. This time, a man behind me cleared his throat softly, the sound polite but pointed. I stepped aside immediately, embarrassed by the disruption. He passed with a nod that lingered a second too long, his expression thoughtful in a way that suggested I'd violated an unspoken expectation. I began to notice how people looked at me near that corner. Not suspiciously, not with fear, with patience. The kind reserved for someone who needs a little extra time to catch up. It was subtle, but it accumulated, a steady pressure that suggested the problem wasn't the snowman at all, it was my reaction to it. One afternoon, I overheard two people talking as they approached the bend in the sidewalk. I slowed instinctively, preparing myself for the familiar tension. One of them laughed quietly and said, "He still does that." I turned, expecting to see them looking at the snowman. They were looking at me. Their expressions weren't unkind, they weren't mocking, they were observational, almost fond, as if discussing a known quirk. I felt heat rise in my face, a sharp embarrassment that had nowhere to go. By the time I looked back, they were already past me, conversation continuing as though nothing unusual had happened. That night, I replayed the moment repeatedly, searching for an explanation that didn't involve me being singled out. I considered the possibility that I was projecting, that stress or exhaustion had sharpened my awareness beyond what was reasonable. That explanation was comfortable. It offered a solution that required no action beyond self-correction. The next day, I tested it. I approached the snowman deliberately, forcing myself not to slow down. I fixed my gaze ahead, matched my pace to the people in front of me, and walked past without hesitation. The effort was immense, my body resisting with every step, but I made it through. Nothing happened. No comments, no looks, no tension. The relief was immediate and disproportionate, a rush that left me unsettled once it faded. I realized then that the discomfort I'd been feeling wasn't constant. It only surfaced when I allowed myself to notice the snowman. Ignoring it restored equilibrium, not just for me, but for the space around me. That realization felt like a warning. Over the following days, I practiced. Each time I passed the park entrance, I kept my pace steady, my attention forward. The snowman receded into peripheral awareness, its presence acknowledged only enough to avoid collision. People stopped watching me, conversations resumed their normal cadence. Whatever tension I'd been generating dissolved, and yet, the effort left a residue. I found myself thinking about the snowman at odd moments, replaying its shape, its placement, the way it fit too well into the curve of the path. The thoughts felt intrusive, unwelcome, but also dangerous in a way I couldn't articulate. Each time I let myself dwell on them, the discomfort returned, sharper than before. I understood then what the unspoken rule was. Notice it too much, and you become the disruption. Noticing wasn't forbidden explicitly. There were no signs, no warnings, but the social correction was immediate and gentle, guiding behavior without confrontation. The system worked because it didn't feel like enforcement, it felt like consensus. By the end of the week, I had stopped pausing entirely. My steps adjusted automatically, my gaze passed over the snowman without engagement. The relief that followed felt earned, deserved, as though I had finally learned something obvious. That night, as I lay in bed, I tried to picture the snowman clearly. The image slipped away almost immediately. What remained was the memory of standing still while everyone else moved on, and the certainty that whatever had been wrong in that moment had not been the snowman. It had been me. The adjustment worked too well. After a few days of steady pacing and deliberate indifference, the corner by the park entrance lost its friction. My body learned the curve without thought. My eyes skimmed past the space where the snowman stood, registering only enough information to keep me moving. People stopped watching me. The small looks of patience faded. Conversations around me resumed their natural rhythm. Whatever tension I had been carrying leaked out quietly, leaving behind something that felt like relief. That was the first warning. Relief arrived without resolution, unearned and immediate, the way it does when you give in rather than understand. I noticed the absence before I noticed anything else. The constant edge of awareness dulled. The snowman receded into the background of my thoughts, not forgotten, just deprioritized. The effort to ignore it diminished until it no longer felt like effort at all. One evening, a coworker fell into step beside me as we walked home. When we reached the bend near the park, he didn't slow, neither did I. He smiled faintly, not at me exactly, but with the satisfaction of someone who sees a problem resolve itself. "Better," he said, lightly. I nodded, the motion automatic. Later that night, I tried to remember why the snowman had bothered me in the first place. The reasons came back blurred, like details recalled from a conversation overheard rather than experienced. Placement, gaze, reaction. None of it held the same weight it once had. The thoughts felt abstract, safe to examine without consequence. That frightened me more than the unease ever had. A week passed, then another. Snow fell again, light and clean, refreshing the shape without drawing attention. The snowman blended seamlessly into winter's return, its presence justified by weather rather than questioned. I walked past it every day without stopping. The park entrance felt normal again, efficient, unobstructed by thought. I realized I hadn't seen anyone build or repair the snowman in days. It didn't seem to need maintenance. Its surface stayed firm, its placement stayed exact. Whatever held it there no longer required participation. One morning, as I approached the bend, I felt the faintest hesitation in my stride. It was subtle enough that I might have missed it, if I'd still been paying attention. The hesitation passed, corrected almost immediately by habit. I didn't slow, I didn't look, I kept moving. Behind me, someone laughed quietly. The sound wasn't mocking, it wasn't directed, it was the soft release of tension, the kind that comes when something finally behaves as expected. I understood then that my earlier discomfort hadn't been a warning about the snowman. It had been feedback. That night, I dreamed I was standing at the corner alone, the path empty in both directions. The snowman stood where it always had, unchanged. I tried to stop myself from slowing as I approached, but my legs refused to move faster. When I finally reached it, I realized I couldn't remember why I was there at all. The thought that I had ever hesitated felt strange, almost embarrassing. I woke with that feeling intact. The next day, I passed the snowman and felt nothing. No tension, no curiosity, no pull to look back. The absence felt complete, sealed. I understood that whatever part of me had once resisted had been corrected gently, patiently, until it learned the right response. Weeks later, I overheard someone new ask about the corner. Not about the snowman directly, just a casual question about the park entrance. The answer came quickly, confidently, and without elaboration. "That's just how it is," someone said. I recognized the tone immediately. Calm, settled, closed. As spring approached, the snowman remained longer than the snow around it, but the contrast didn't register the way it once would have. It looked appropriate, even when it shouldn't have. The idea that it might not belong there no longer occurred to me naturally. It had to be summoned, forced, and even then it felt indulgent. I stopped trying. On a warm afternoon, I realized I couldn't picture the corner without the snowman at all. The path curved the way it always had. People walked it smoothly, efficiently. The memory of stopping there felt distant, like recalling a habit you grew out of without noticing when. That was when I understood what had changed. The snowman hadn't needed to be ignored, it had needed me to learn that reacting was unnecessary, and once that lesson settled in, there was no longer anything left to question. The first thing people adjusted was the ground. It started after a heavy snowfall, the kind that compresses everything into uneven shapes and leaves sidewalks lopsided by morning. The snowman stood in a small town square near the war memorial, positioned a few steps off the main path, far enough not to block foot traffic but close enough to be unavoidable. 3 compact sections, clean edges, coal eyes placed evenly, branch arms angled slightly outward. Nothing decorative, nothing symbolic, just precise. I noticed the adjustment while walking to work. A man crouched near the snowman's base, packing fresh snow against one side with his gloved hands. He worked carefully, pressing and smoothing until the surface matched the rest of the structure. When he finished, he stood, brushed his gloves together, and continued on his way without looking at the snowman's face. No one commented. Later that morning, someone else did the same thing. Different person, same motion. A shallow dip at the base corrected. Snow gathered from the edges, pressed inward, smoothed flat. The act felt routine, unremarkable, like straightening a crooked sign or nudging a chair back into alignment. By afternoon, the ground around the snowman had become firm and level, a compacted platform that looked intentional despite having no clear purpose. Footprints avoided it naturally. People stepped around the space without noticing they were doing so, their paths curving smoothly as if guided by an unspoken rule. I asked a coworker about it over lunch. "About what?" she asked. "The snowman," I said. "People keep fixing it." She thought for a moment, then shrugged. "It's supposed to look right." The answer ended the conversation before it could start. Over the next few days, the corrections continued. Someone adjusted a branch arm that had sagged slightly overnight. Another person repositioned a coal eye that had shifted by a fraction. Each act was small, precise, and completed without ceremony. No one stayed long, no one watched anyone else do it. The snowman was never discussed directly. What unsettled me wasn't that people cared about the snowman, it was that they cared without caring. No one took ownership, no one claimed responsibility. The maintenance was distributed, casual, and consistent, like breathing, like blinking. Something done because it felt wrong not to. I tried to ignore it at first, but the pattern was impossible to unsee once it settled in. The snowman never degraded for long. Any imbalance was corrected within hours. Even during warmer afternoons when other snow figures slumped and collapsed, this one held its shape, refreshed constantly by unseen hands. One evening, as dusk settled over the square, I watched a woman stop briefly near it. She hesitated, looked at the branch arm, then stepped closer and adjusted it slightly upward. The movement was delicate, almost respectful. When she stepped back, she nodded faintly to herself and walked on. I realized then that no one was asking why. There were no instructions posted. No signs, no one organizing the effort. Yet the ritual persisted, self-sustaining, embedded into the flow of the town. The snowman didn't demand attention, it demanded alignment. That night, I dreamed of hands. Not faces, not bodies, just hands reaching in from the edges of the square, smoothing, pressing, correcting. The snowman stayed still at the center, unchanged, while the hands worked tirelessly to keep it that way. When I woke, the image stayed with me longer than it should have. The next morning, I passed the square again and noticed something new. The ground around the snowman was perfectly level. Not just packed, measured, as if someone had decided, without telling anyone else, that this was how things were meant to remain. The first act of prevention looked like consideration. A thin rope appeared one morning, looped loosely between two short posts that hadn't been there the day before. It didn't block the square, it didn't warn anyone away, it simply suggested a boundary, the kind you instinctively respect without questioning. People stepped around it naturally, adjusting their paths as if it had always guided movement that way. No sign explained it, no one acknowledged it. The snowman stood at the center of the new perimeter, its base untouched, its shape unchanged. The rope didn't protect people from the snowman, it protected the snowman from disruption. I watched as a man carrying a shovel approached the square, and paused when he reached the rope. He looked at the snowman, then at the ground inside the boundary, then back at the path. After a moment, he turned away, choosing a longer route that avoided the space entirely. His decision looked effortless, almost relieved. By afternoon, the rope had been reinforced. Another loop appeared, slightly wider, correcting the angle of approach. The adjustments were subtle, careful not to inconvenience anyone too obviously. The square remained usable. The snowman remained centered. The ritual grew without announcement. I noticed people beginning to anticipate problems before they happened. A child running ahead of his parent was gently redirected away from the square, with a hand on his shoulder and a murmured correction. Someone brushed loose snow off the rope before it could sag. A passerby adjusted a post that had leaned slightly overnight. No one discussed these actions. They happened in silence, coordinated by instinct rather than instruction. The snowman no longer needed repair, it needed preservation. One evening, I watched a maintenance truck approach the square. The driver slowed, scanned the area, and stopped short of the rope. He stayed in the cab for a full minute, engine idling, before backing up and choosing a different route. The square was not on his list anymore, or perhaps it had been quietly removed. The ritual shifted again after that. People began arriving earlier than necessary, passing through the square before work, before errands, before daylight fully settled. They paused briefly near the rope, scanning the snowman for irregularities. If none were found, they moved on. If something felt off, a slight sag, an uneven edge, someone stepped forward to correct it, hands moving with practiced certainty. I noticed that the same people weren't always involved. Participation rotated, no one lingered long enough to be identified as responsible. The ritual avoided ownership by design. I tried to interrupt it. One afternoon, when the square was nearly empty, I stepped over the rope and approached the snowman directly. The packed ground felt different underfoot, firmer than the surrounding pavement, calibrated. I raised my hand, unsure what I intended to do, disturb it, mark it, anything to introduce deviation. I didn't get the chance. A voice behind me spoke calmly, not loud, not urgent. "Hey." I turned to see a man standing just outside the rope. His expression was neutral, attentive. Not angry, not afraid. You don't need to do that, he said. The statement wasn't a request, it wasn't a threat, it was information, delivered the way you might warn someone about a wet floor. I stepped back immediately, heat rising in my face. The man nodded once, satisfied, and walked away. Within minutes, someone repacked the snow where my footprints had disturbed the surface. The square returned to balance. That night, I realized the ritual had developed safeguards. Not rules written down or spoken aloud, but responses embedded in behavior, correction, redirection, restoration. The sequence repeated whenever necessary, smooth and efficient. I asked around, carefully, about who was responsible for maintaining the square. The answers were vague. The town. People. It just stays like that. No one remembered when the rope had first appeared, no one questioned why it was needed. The explanation had become unnecessary. The snowman no longer marked a place, it marked a process. By the end of the week, the square felt different even when it was empty. The space inside the rope carried weight, an invisible pressure that guided movement without force. People adjusted before thinking, I did too, catching myself mid-step and correcting my path automatically. That realization stayed with me. Because it meant the ritual was no longer something I was observing, it was something I was beginning to participate in, without ever deciding to do so. The ritual reached its quiet conclusion without ceremony, the way all the others had begun. It happened the morning the snowman tilted. Not much, just enough to be wrong. I noticed it before anyone else did, or at least before anyone acted. One side of the middle section had compressed slightly overnight, the symmetry disturbed by a subtle lean that threw the whole structure off balance. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't in danger of falling, but it was incorrect in a way that tugged at attention. I slowed without thinking. That was when I realized how many other people had already slowed too. They gathered at the edges of the square, not clustering, not crowding, just arriving in loose sequence as though responding to the same internal prompt. No one spoke, no one pointed. The rope remained undisturbed, its boundary respected instinctively. For a moment, nothing happened, then someone stepped forward. I didn't recognize her. She moved with quiet certainty, slipping beneath the rope and kneeling at the base. Her hands worked quickly, packing snow from the edges, redistributing pressure, restoring balance. Another person joined her without looking at anyone else, adjusting the opposite side. A third repositioned a coal eye that had shifted slightly off level. The movements were efficient, familiar, rehearsed. I felt the urge to help, before I recognized it as an urge at all. My foot lifted, I caught myself and froze, heart pounding. The impulse had been automatic, the same reflex that made you straighten a crooked picture without realizing you'd noticed it. I stood there, fighting it, watching as the group worked. Within minutes, the snowman stood straight again. No one acknowledged the completion. The people who had stepped forward stood, brushed their gloves clean, and dispersed. The square emptied smoothly, returning to its usual flow. The rope remained, the snowman remained, balance restored. Something inside me tightened. That afternoon, I avoided the square entirely. I took side streets, detoured through alleys, did anything to break the pattern. The effort felt heavy, disproportionate, like resisting gravity. When I finally returned the next day, the sense of relief that washed over me was immediate and disturbing. The snowman stood perfectly aligned. I noticed new details then. The ground inside the rope had been subtly graded, sloping just enough to prevent runoff from pooling. Snowbanks around the perimeter had been trimmed evenly. The space had been optimized without a plan, refined through countless small corrections no one remembered making. I understood then that the ritual wasn't about the snowman surviving winter, it was about the town practicing coordination. A drill without an announced emergency. A system tested quietly, repeatedly, until it no longer needed conscious thought. The snowman was just the focal point, the excuse that made participation feel harmless. That night, I dreamed of the square empty, the rope gone, the snowman absent. People still curved their paths around the space, stepping carefully, adjusting their movements as if something fragile occupied the air. In the dream, no one questioned it. The behavior persisted even without the object. I woke with the realization lodged firmly in place. The ritual didn't depend on the snowman anymore. A week later, a sudden warm front swept through. Rain fell hard enough to erase most of the remaining snow overnight. By morning, the square was bare except for a shallow depression where the snowman had stood. The rope lay slack on the ground, posts pulled loose by softened earth. People arrived anyway. They stopped at the edge of the depression, scanning it briefly, assessing. Someone tamped down the wet soil with a boot, another adjusted a post upright and relooped the rope loosely, restoring the boundary despite the absence at its center. No one looked confused. By afternoon, a new snowman stood there, smaller than the last. Less refined, but centered, aligned, correct. I didn't remember seeing anyone build it. As winter faded into spring, the square remained active. Adjustments continued, even as snow became scarce. When the snowman finally failed to reform one morning, people maintained the space regardless, preserving the boundary, correcting the ground, ensuring the shape of absence stayed intact. I realized then that the ritual had achieved its purpose, it no longer needed a reason. Some habits don't exist to serve what they protect, they exist to keep people practiced at responding together, quietly, efficiently, without needing to be told why, and once a town learns how to do that, it never truly stops. You have been listening to The Whispering Hour. Before you drift back into the dark, let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and which moment stayed with you the longest. Your whispers guide the night still waiting to unfold. Sleep well, if you can.